So
It's
Robert
kind of
is
embarrassing.
no, it's actually great. So Robert is known for his groundbreaking research on stress and its effect on health, behavior, and social hierarchy. Uh, Robert's work has explored the ways in which stress impacts the body and the brain, and how it can contribute to a range of physical and mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, cardiovascular disorders, and immune dysfunction as well. He has also studied the biology of aggression, the impact of social hierarchies on behavior, and the genetic and environmental factors that influence our response to stress. And in addition to his research, Robert is also an acclaimed author. He has written several popular science books, including Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. I have a copy here. And also Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. So these books have helped to bring complex scientific concepts to a wider audience and have earned Robert a reputation as one of the most engaging and insightful science writers of all time. Today, on this episode, we will be exploring the ways in which Robert's work plays to the unique challenges faced by people in Iraq in terms of their physical and mental health. We'll also discuss the cultural factors that shape the experience of stress, as well as biological mechanisms, maybe that underline the body's response to stress. We'll also explore some of the key insights from Robert's books and how they can help us better understand our own behavior and the behavior of others. So, without further ado, Robert, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very happy. I'm thrilled to
Well,
have you on. I mean, to talk to you in person. That's really great. Thank you.
well,
Uh,
thanks. Glad to be here. Thanks for sticking my books there. I see a George R. R. Martin novel there
yes,
also, so I'm
yes. There.
glad to be in good company.
Have you read them yourself?
I've read about halfway through the first one, mainly because my son went off to college and took all of them with him. So,
Yeah, I
so
did.
the
I don't
plan
think
is
I
to get
finished
it
them
back
either.
at some point.
All right. So, Robert, can you tell us a bit about yourself? Like, uh, what you do right now, so that people in Iraq right now are not very familiar with your work, probably, uh, mainly because it's in English. And my goal for today, honestly, is uh, I've seen your work. I've seen how it helped me as a person, and I'm sure with the proper explanation and proper maybe translation, even people in here can benefit from it greatly. So if you can tell us a bit about yourself, your work, and why you chose to do your research on such topics like stress, social hierarchies like the primates memoir, and also behavior.
Well, thanks. First off, apologies that I'm one of these provincial Americans where all I could do is function in English.
Oh,
So
I'm
that
sorry.
that constraints for that. Let's see. I've kind of spent my life oscillating back and forth between being a laboratory scientist and lab and people cloning things about neurons and molecular neurobiology and such. And then for 33 years, during the summers, picking up and going to East Africa, where I would study a population of baboons living in one of the national parks there, and the same animals for all those years. The same tree that I had my tent under for all those years. But what I would be doing there was kind of a complement to my lab work. I could not decide if I wanted to be a laboratory scientist or a field biologist, so I was very lucky in getting to do both. But what I was studying out in the field with my baboons was, what does your social rank, what does your patterns of social behavior have to do with how well your body is doing with stress related disease? And these were wild animals that nonetheless I could dart with a blowgun system
Yeah.
to anesthetize, and where I could do a clinical workup on them out there for a day and let them go the next day kind of thing, trying to understand how their bodies were working, what it had to do with their social behavior. And then when getting to questions about, well, how is that working in the brain, back to the laboratory where predominantly with lab rats,
Hmm.
doing neurobiology related to that. So I've been incredibly lucky getting to spend my whole career bouncing back and forth between the two.
Yeah,
And for some reason, stress has always struck me as an incredibly important topic to study.
it is very
Probably
important.
because
Yeah.
I think I'm a poster child for that insofar as how stressed I am all the time. So I've been researching myself by way of baboons and lab rats all these years.
So maybe that was your inspiration to start writing your experience in Africa, or how did it start?
Actually, yes, I initially went there for a bit more than a year, and then it would be 4 month seasons, but then adulthood
Hmm.
became an issue. So 3 month seasons, 2 month seasons. But when you're out there, this is out in a national park, the Serengeti. It was pretty remote, about 30 miles from an electric outlet for any power,
Wow.
things like that. So you get isolated like that, and you get very, very dependent on mail. I'd get mail once every 2 weeks at the park headquarters,
Yeah.
and like all you live for then is your mail. So you're just writing to an enormous number of people in the hopes that anyone would write back. And somehow, in the process of that, I was not a writer before I started doing field work, and I just kind of discovered that was a very like pleasing thing to do. So I kind of evolved into being a writer out of that.
Wow, that's great. So, out of your many books, which was the most challenging to write?
Um, oh, well, that's a good question. What I'm supposed to say as a writer is, of course, the next book. The next book, that's the challenging one.
It's
I
determined, right?
actually,
The next book?
yes, thank God I'm done with it. I finished it about 3 weeks ago after working on it for 5 years.
Wow,
Um,
it's done now.
it's done now. In fact, I'm getting the galleys in about 2 days or so. So I've got 2 days left to sort of get ready to read the book one more time and spot all the parts that I can't stand and want to fix and all of that, except they're not going to let me do much now. Um, this one was a bruiser. This was 5 years. Um, you know, the pandemic sort of
Yeah.
locked me up for long stretches. So
Hmm.
after I got over the shock of feeling like the world was ending, I was able to focus back
Yeah.
more on the writing. Uh, this one was a difficult one because it was taking me into a lot of areas where I know absolutely nothing, and I had to do a lot of learning for this one. But I think every writer will say their latest book was the hardest because they most recently were sitting there saying, "Okay, this is beyond me. This time I've finally done it. This is far more than I can actually manage." So
So,
that's the one that's weighing the most on me right now.
so determined is about free will, correct?
Yes, or lack of.
Or lack of free will. Yeah. Like,
Yeah.
I think I was thinking today by the end of this call, I wanted to thank you for everything, for joining me for the whole interview, but I was like, maybe this is determined after all. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not our free will after all. All right. So, uh, how do you think your research and your books can help people cope with their challenges? You studied. You have done a tremendous amount of research, but people in Iraq and countries that were stricken by war and are currently post-war areas, people have suffered from probably long-term stress. So, do you think your books in any ways can help people cope with the challenges of this such stress induced by war?
Well, um, I'm not very good at really giving advice about how not to feel stressed, but what I'm pretty good for is telling you how bad it is for your body if you continue to be stressed.
Yeah.
Um, and I think probably the realm in which that's most relevant, one that like I am practically like a preacher yelling to people about 24 hours a day, is the whole notion that when you look at the effects of stress, particularly chronic psychological stress, and like a country at war certainly will do that. Amid heart problems and digestive problems and immune problems and all of that, the area that is probably most vulnerable is mental health.
Yes.
And the aspect of that that I go on and on about all the time is psychiatric problems, depression, anxiety, and such. These are biological diseases.
Yeah.
These are as real of biological disorders as if you've gotten heart disease or diabetes or such. These are very real and a tragedy, certainly where I am, and I sense in much of the world still, including your part, is that people feel a sense of stigma, a sense of shame
Definitely.
about mental health.
Yes.
Um, you break a bone and you've got to have your leg in a cast for 2 months afterward. You don't feel shame. You don't feel as if there's something weak about you. The fact that like you can't put weight on your bone, you have a different type of biological problem. There's something screwed up with a neurotransmitter in your brain. As a result, you feel sad all the time or you feel worried all the time. And that's a biological disorder also. And you should no more be able to like solve that on your own
Yes.
than you should be able to solve a broken leg on your own.
You need a doctor. You need medical help eventually, to get that fixed. Correct. So, you know, uh, s-
Absolutely.
um, in your book, why zebras don't get ulcers, you discuss in detail the stress response and how it can affect the immune response and the body in general. So can you give us more insight on this part so that people can, be more aware of how stress in more detail can impact their bodies?
Well, one of the things that you do if you spend your time being a neurobiologist is you are constantly surprised by, I had no idea the brain can influence that. A
Mhm.
different part of the body, seemingly a separate system. And the notion that the brain, your thoughts, your emotions, your psychological state,
Mhm.
your mental health, all of that could affect how well your immune system goes about fighting off a disease, how well your immune system makes antibodies, things like that, which, when I was first starting out, this was like revolutionary. This was this whole new field called psychoneuroimmunology, and which is just a given by now. What's happening in your brain affects your immune defenses. And as a general rule, if you were chronically stressed, if you were chronically stressed for purely psychological reasons, for the most part, that's not going to be doing good things to your immune system. You are going to be more at risk for a bunch of infectious diseases. You are going to have too much of a tendency for inflammation in your body, a whole bunch of different things, which still, like, you think a thought, and like your bone marrow, where you make, you know, immune cells, works differently.
Mhm.
But this is absolutely the case. And chronic stress is going to do bad things for that part of your body.
So I have a question. Some of the people I have discussion with, you mentioned yourself that the whole topic is stigmatic in Iraq, and some people who are educated, who have reached a certain level of education, whether it's medical or non-medical, they have this belief that mental health, or therapy, or psychiatry in general, even prescription medication, they think it doesn't work, and many of them have this underlying belief that it's, especially those working in the medical field, they think that since it's all based on, like depression is based on serotonin hypothesis, schizophrenia is based on the hypothesis that dopamine is causing, or elevation of dopamine can be causing the schizophrenia. So since it's based on hypotheses and it's not really based on scientific facts, you find many people who are skeptical on the efficiency and value of treating mental conditions. So what do you think?
Well, one could go through a theory, and studies of rats have shown this, and studies of monkeys have shown that. On the simplest basis, you take a drug like a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, you take a drug like that, and what it does is it increases the amount of serotonin signaling in parts of your brain. And a significant percentage of people who were so depressed they could barely get out of bed in the morning feel better. This isn't a theory. You've just shown the efficacy, the effectiveness of a biochemical intervention. It's, real biology. And when you can get to the point of showing individual differences in genes related to how sensitive your brain is going to be to this drug or that drug, it explains that much more. It's theoretical as to why in this person it works a little bit better than in that person. But the main thing is you take people whose lives are devastated by some of these mental illnesses and you throw in the right medication, and you have shown this is not a theory. This is the
It
best
actually works.
science happening. It actually works.
Yeah. All right. So, uh, since we're talking about Iraqis specifically and Middle Eastern communities, maybe in general, the communities here might be a bit different from the communities in the United States. And I'm talking two terms. For the first type, the first difference maybe is communities in here people are more bound to each other. People like I had friends who went to the West. They went to Sweden, went to Finland, and it was abnormal for people to socialize so much in there. Not abnormal, but not as common as it is in here in the Middle East or in Iraq in particular. So in your book, Behave, you discuss how cultural practices and social structures can shape individual behavior, and how how can this understanding be applied to addressing mental health issues? Like, if you are living in a society where people are bound to each other, where family connections are expected to be strong, I don't know if I'm making sense at all, but the effect of the community itself, the effect of the society, the expectations of a family, these affect your mental health in a way. It can be a good thing where having people to talk to all the time, having people to socialize with, being expected to socialize with others, that can be an upside because you're always socializing. And there is also this downside if you're not conforming to the expectation, and if you're not being a part of the community, it can also affect your life as a person, as an individual. So how can these cultural practices affect stress? That makes sense.
Exactly. Cultural differences. Okay, here's one of my favorite studies showing this, and people who sort of study cross-cultural aspects of neurobiology and behavior and such. What they tend to do is make a division between what are called individualist cultures, and the United States is like the most extreme one on earth, and what are called collectivist cultures, where every time when people are doing those studies, they always study people in the southern part of China, in Southeast Asia, because highly collectivist agricultural practices, and there's totally interesting research on how that's bound to ecology and agricultural differences, but you get dramatically different cultures. So here's the study that I love. You sit down an American and you say, okay, tell me about times that you've done something that's influenced other people, and tell me about times that other people have influenced you. And what Americans will do is give far more examples of where they have influenced other people.
Uh-huh.
aha, I have an impact on those around me. And what somebody from Southeast Asia will do is tell you far more cases about times that others have influenced them. Now you say, oh, that's really interesting. You American, you talking so much about times you've influenced other people. Tell me about one of those times where other people have influenced you. Tell me about that in detail. And you get them to do that, and they start secreting stress hormones. And you get someone from Southeast Asia, and you ask them, tell me about a time where you influenced somebody else, and they start secreting stress hormones. For an
Wow.
American, it is very stressful to admit that anyone has had any influence on you, as opposed to you have been a pioneer in everything you've done. And in somebody in Southeast Asia, it's extremely stressful to talk about a time that you have had an influence on people, because
Mhm.
that seems egotistical, it seems nonconformist, it seems like, oh my God, depending on the culture you were raised in, you have absolutely opposite sort of neural circuitry as to
Mhm.
what counts as I'm starting to feel uncomfortable and don't want to talk about this. It's totally fascinating. So yeah, culture makes a big difference.
It's really interesting, thinking that one being raised. I mean, once you're born, your basic characteristics are defined. Your height, your maybe even genetic diseases, your ethnicity. But to think that the society or your community affects you in that way, it's really mind blowing. I mean, even simple things like talking about your achievement, talking about your life, and that leading to secreting stress hormones. That's really interesting. So do you think that social dynamics and hierarchies, like in communities like Iraq, like social hierarchy here is it's very apparent in households and community and workplaces. Uh, how can that how can this understanding be utilized in a beneficial way to build a more cohesive, a stronger community? Since hierarchy is kind of built in our communities, can that can we take a positive aspect and convert that into something that can be used and to build a stronger, more cohesive community, especially in communities like Iraq, where people have suffered displacement, violence, uh, religious, division, basically, where people who used to be neighbors or friends, they suddenly they just had to become worst enemies.
It's, well, it's just to say, I feel almost ashamed making any comments on something like Iraq, because I live in a much more privileged place, and my politics happen to be that the United States is the cause of many of the tragic problems in Iraq over these decades. But I probably should not wade into that too much. But what becomes clear is, amid the dangers of conformity being imposed by social networks, things of that sort, it's enormously protective in terms of your health. Um, if there are people who you can lean on, if they are people who your parents were leaning on their parents, and there's long-term stability, that's enormously protective, and that makes a huge difference in health. Um, and to state the obvious, if circumstances make you a refugee, if circumstances make you far from home, if circumstances make you incredibly isolated and lonely, you are a very, very stressed primate. And what should be there is being someone who could take advantage of social support, and being someone who can offer social support is medically probably the best thing you can do about stress in the world. And, you know,
Yeah.
try to fight for that.
All right.
Um, a great sort of demonstration of that, in terms of like baboons. Okay, so baboons get stressed, and like baboons have something stressful and upsetting happen to them. And what they do is they sit and they socially groom each other. They all sit down and they pick through each other's fur, and looking for bugs, but what they're doing is they're comforting each other. And it's the sort of thing like a lion jumps out and almost kills someone, and everybody gets away, and it's just so upsetting and so scary. And then everybody just sits down and they groom each other for an hour after that before they go back to doing anything else. Grooming is really important. So social grooming, it reduces stress. So you ask a question. So which is better if you're a baboon? What's better for lowering your blood pressure? Spending a lot of time being groomed
Yeah.
by the other baboons, or spending a lot of time grooming someone else? And grooming someone else does better things for your blood pressure than being groomed.
When being groomed or
It's
when you
better
groom others?
grooming someone else, putting the effort into doing that as connectedness. That I thought that was like the most wonderful. I should go out and like teach people about how to groom each other, like baboons. Being needed, being a source of support is a
Yeah.
wonderful way to feel like there's a reason why I am here.
Wow.
People's lives are being made better by my existence, in
So
lots of ways.
in a way, the best way to support yourself is to support others.
Um, Absolutely wonderful studies. Other versions, you take test subjects and you give them, we're giving you $100
Hmm.
and you could spend it on anything you want. And people who spent it on gifts for their friends
Yeah.
um, describe themselves as much happier afterward than people who spend the money on themselves.
Wow. That's really
You
interesting.
know,
So
we're
since you mentioned your work in Kenya, working with baboons, I mean, the fact that you spent so much time in there and you wrote a whole book, the Primate's Memoir, uh, I really want to know what inspired you in the first place to spend that much time in Kenya and doing your research on baboons.
um, well, I was actually 8 years old when I decided I wanted to go live in a tent my entire life and study wild primates. I still don't completely understand where that came from, but I was one of those people who knew that they wanted to do what they wanted to do from a ridiculously early age. And like by the time I was 12, I was reading textbooks on animal behavior. I was writing letters to primatologists saying, "Ooh, I want to be just like you when I grow up. And can you like, can you take me to your field site someday?" Um, and I've back when I would meet some of these people who were like by then really elderly, they would say, you were the one who would send those letters." I would get these crazy letters from this 12-year-old kid saying, "Oh my God, I want to do field work, and here's my theory about this or that." And, I was very lucky I got to work with one of these people, and very lucky that I got to go out into the field. The big complication was somewhere early in college. I got fascinated with the brain also, and had this whole crisis. Am I a neurobiologist or am I a field biologist? And being lucky enough to go back and forth between the two. But I somehow decided,
You were
you know,
interested as from your childhood. You were completely interested in the topic. I can tell.
completely fascinated with it. And frankly, completely fascinated with the notion that you could just pick up and, go live with another species and spend your time doing that. I
So,
was I was a pretty solitary kid.
so what were most of your the most memorable things that happened to you in the field, working with baboons?
Well, I guess the process of darting them, like these are wild baboons. They're running around the Serengeti, and like each year when I would come back, I would have to go figure out like, okay, which forest are they sleeping in these days, and like track them down. And like these are fully wild animals
Yeah,
who hunt, who would be hunted by other animals. So the notion that, well, for one thing, I could spend enough time around them so that they would get used to me,
yeah.
where I could walk around with them and they wouldn't freak out and like that took merely about a year of conditioning them to that,
Mhm.
that I could do that, and that every now and then I could dart somebody with an anesthetic and like study his body and like do the same clinical tests that like they would do on you if you like go in to see your doctor. Oh, how's your cholesterol levels? How well is your immune system working? How well? And the next day release them and go back to walking around with them. And just that was just magical that I could do that.
Wow. So, uh, I want to discuss your other books too, but I have one last question about a primate's memoir, because it's really interesting to see someone spending so much time studying the social dynamics of another species, basically, and then eventually compared that to the social dynamics of humans. So we just mentioned sort of a parallel, like how helping others lowers the blood pressure of baboons. Were there other parallels between the social dynamics of baboons and humans?
Yeah, lots of them. They're very similar to us in lots of ways. If you haven't been thinking about baboons since you were 8 years old, let me tell you a bit about them. They live in these complex social groups, 50 individuals, 100 individuals. They'll live for 20 years, like very complex social systems.
Hmm.
And what's most interesting about them for me is they actually have very easy lives. If you're a baboon in the Serengeti in East Africa, you only have to work about 3 hours a day to get enough food.
How do I apply?
And how do you, well, there's downsides though, there's problems,
Yeah.
and they're very human problems. Um, your child is more likely to survive than the children of the nearby humans. Lions really don't bother you very often because these are big, aggressive baboons, or can hold off a lion if they get a few of them cooperating, kind of thing. So what does that mean? You only have to work 3 hours a day to fill your stomach. It means you have about 9 hours every day to devote to social interactions.
Hmm.
And what that often translates into is you've got all this free time into making other baboons completely miserable with psychological stress. All they do is psychologically stress each other in terms of social hierarchies and things like that. They're perfect models for humans because
Wow.
very few of us are having to go out to hunt to get our food anymore. Mostly what we have is the free time to generate psychological nonsense and then fall for it so much that it influences our health. They're perfect. They're perfect models for us. So a lot of insights there just seem enormously familiar.
Hmm.
I would say two have stood out, um, reflecting in some ways the fact that when I started studying them, I was 20 years old. And I
Hmm.
was a 20-year-old male, which means that I was kind of a jerk in a lot of ways. And I believed in dominance and all of that.
Yeah.
And the first sort of thing that I had to unlearn, if you asked me as a 20-year-old what was going to get a baboon the healthiest possible body, and my answer would be by being high ranking in the hierarchy. That was going to be a hugely predictive factor in all of that. Being able to like achieve a high dominance rank. And kind of by the time I was 30, what I would say was the most important predictor was not achieving high dominance, but knowing how to hold on to it, maintain it, hold on and stay in that position for a long time. And becoming high ranking was all about aggression and winning the best fights and all of that. Holding on to a high rank is all about social intelligence and building cooperative patterns with other baboons and being smart and knowing who you can trust and who you can't trust, and realizing that like muscle and aggression may have a lot to do with becoming number one in a troop. But if you were going to be a social idiot, you
Yeah.
were going to be gone after 2 months. That social intelligence was far more of a predictor.
So
But then the bigger thing I learned was by the time I was like age 40, I was finally smart enough to realize this, that if you have a choice in the matter between being high ranking or having a lot of individuals to groom and a lot of them to groom you back and being socially connected, choose the social connection every single time. That's going to be much better for your health. And if you had told me that as a 20-year-old, I would have thought that was ridiculous.
it's
Social
amazing how
connectedness.
it's amazing how your thought process evolved over time when it comes to this. And
Yes.
when you were describing the whole community and how you keep your high ranking in the community, I was thinking, is he describing a troop of baboons, or is he describing a modern company? Because what you described just perfectly applies to a workplace where you want to stay for a long time. You just have to be socially intelligent. You have to know who to trust, and all the things you mentioned is just apparel. That's really interesting.
Yep.
Yeah.
They're close relatives in lots of ways.
Yeah. So, I would love to discuss your second book, Behave, the biology of humans at our best and worst. Uh, so it really explores the complexities of human behavior and the many factors that influence it overall. So, can you give us some key insights from your entire book, just for people to understand what the book is about?
Well, the theme in there reflects in many ways how I've been bouncing back and forth between a field biologist and a laboratory scientist. Out in the field, I think about evolution, I think about social behavior, I think about hormones, I think about immune function, I think about sociology and
Mm-hmm.
mental health because that's kind of relevant to baboons. When I'm in the laboratory, I'm thinking about single neurons and genes and manipulating them and neurochemicals. So I kind of have to span a wide range of areas. And what that has made me was completely impatient with the types of scientists where you would say, oh, that behavior was so interesting. Where did that behavior come from? And they'll say, oh, because of this gene, because of this brain chemical, because of this hormone, because of this childhood experience, because of this thing that explains everything. And one single thing explains nothing about our behavior. And you look at someone who's done something and it's wonderful, or it's violent and criminal, or it's something in between, whatever it is. And, we say, whoa, where did that behavior come from? Why did they do that? And to really understand behavior, whether in a mouse or human, when you say, where did that behavior come from? You're asking a million different questions. You're asking, okay, what went on in that person's brain 2 seconds ago that caused them to use their muscles to pull the trigger on this gun, or to use their muscles to embrace somebody so they will feel better? What was going on in their brain? Oh, well, that's the explanation. This part of the brain did this part did that, all of that. But you're also asking, well, what did the person's hormone levels this morning in their bloodstream have to do with how sensitive this or that part of the brain would be? What did the person's levels of stimulation and stress and trauma over the last 6 months have to do with how well that brain was functioning? What did the teenage years of that individual, what was childhood? What about their fetal life? Because that has a huge amount to do with what kind of brain you constructed. What about your genes? What about your culture? What about your evolution? If you want to understand where behavior is coming from, you've got to consider everything from 1 second before to a million years before, because all of those interact and all of those are what makes us who we are.
So, in a way, you're saying that our genes, or even our lives, our day-to-day lives over the past months or years, our childhood, it all affects how we make a decision and the process and the kind of decision we make. So, in a way, our decisions are pre-decided by multiple factors that are not within our current control. So, that brings us to a very sensitive topic, maybe, or many people perceive it as sensitive or hard to understand, free will. Uh, is it really within our free will to decide what to do on every day? I mean, I decided to reach out, and you decided to approve being on this call. Were we destined to be on this call today, or is it our free will?
Well, I happen to be way, way out on the extreme, even among neurobiologists, to the extent to which I believe we have no free will. Um, when you look at where our behavior is coming from, they are being influenced by the craziest things, the stuff going on underneath inside us, where we have no idea that that's actually where our behaviors are coming from. Let me give you two examples that sort of show the extremes of the biological influences on us.
Hmm.
One of them is I I love this study. You take somebody
Hmm.
and you give them a questionnaire. How do you feel about this subject, that subject, politics? What do you feel about a traditional enemy of your people? What do you feel about social policies, economics? We're going to go through a whole list of things,
Hmm.
and you get a sense of what that person's opinions are. If they are sitting in a room where
Hmm.
there's the smell of bad garbage in there, where there's a terrible smell, people become more hostile to people who are different from them.
Okay.
What? That's going on? You sit in a room where instead they have the smell of freshly baked bread and you become more generous in how you fill out the questionnaire. That's like ridiculous that has your smells, the smell in your environment has
Yeah,
influenced
your
how
decision
long
making.
you say someone should go to jail, whether this is moral or not, whether this should be legal or something. So that's amazing. The smell in a room in the last minute. At the
So
other extreme,
yeah,
you look at different societies on Earth and you look at how open are they to outsiders, how how accepting of the culture, how xenophobic, how hostile they are to outsiders. And one of the predictors is what was the level of disease, infectious disease in this society 400 years ago?
400.
Because 400 cultures that traditionally were dealing with very, very high rates of infectious diseases don't like people coming in from the outside world because that's where diseases come from. 400 years later, that's a predictor. A smell in the room has something to do with your behavior and some of your moral decisions. What your ancestors were doing 400 years ago has something to do with it,
So
and everything in between.
I was just thinking maybe a good project is a bakery right next to a court. That would be very good. Maybe, you know. So
Yes,
maybe
yes.
people can take this concept and say, since I don't have free will, since so many factors decide what and who I am today, how can I control my day-to-day situations, my day-to-day decisions? If some people might take it in a pessimistic sense where I don't have control, this is all predetermined, and I can't manage my stress, I can't manage my anxiety, I can't like this because I was born this way, or my society made me like this. So is it if we is it really possible that we are so free will is so absent that we can't really control our day-to-day decisions, where we can't fight things that bother us on a daily basis, for example?
Well, this is one of the great sort of dangers when you tell people there's no free will, and you tell them the biology of it, and here, let me prove all these examples. The danger is that you decide because we are not making our decisions, because we are not agents independent of our biology, that nothing can change.
Hmm.
Things change to an amazing extent, but what we have to work through, and you look at like historical examples of how much societies can change. You look at individual histories of people, and like, yes, we can all change. We do not choose to change. We are changed by circumstances. And one of the things, perhaps like you learn about stress in particular settings or whatever, and you realize this family interaction is straight out of every textbook for how to feel miserable and stressed. This is this is an enormous source of my problems.
Mhm.
Um, you have learned that. You just learned that because you were raised to read, and you have a mind that's open to new ideas and all the ways in which that comes in. You were raised in a way where you are not so enclosed by conformity that
True.
you have learned it is possible to change your behavior. You have learned about this factor. You have learned that you're most anxious in this setting. So if you were going to tell your family, you know what, I know this is what you expect me to do, but um, I'm not that person. I'm a different person than this, and I need to do this other thing.
Mhm.
Wow, how did you manage to change? Because of all these factors, because you are feeling brave that day, because you've learned not to tell the scary family member this thing when they're hungry or tired,
Yeah.
because their brain chemistry is different, but also because you learned to have a certain degree of value of your own autonomy, because you have learned, you've been capable of learning, because every single thing that went into it. Like I remember one time I was teaching a bunch of judges
Mhm.
about the biology of behavior and the biology of moral decision. Here's another study that's totally amazing,
Okay.
and has been replicated solidly. If you were going to appear in front of a judge
Mhm.
who's deciding whether you were going to rot in jail for the next 5 years or if you were going to be forgiven to go free, what you really, really do not want to do is appear before the judge when the judge is hungry, when it's been 3 or 4 hours since they've had a meal,
The last
because
meal.
judges last appear in the first study that showed this, appear before a judge about an hour after they've had a meal, and you have a 60% chance of getting a favorable decision by the judge. Appear before a judge 4 hours later, and you have about a 5% chance of getting a favorable decision. When people are hungry, they feel less generous. It takes more work to try to view the world from somebody else's perspective. So I'm teaching a bunch of judges about this, and this has been, the more hours it has been since you have eaten a meal, the less time you read somebody's job application before you say, this is not the person for the job. And the more time it has been since a meal, the shorter time it takes somebody in a bank to decide, nah, we're not
I'm
going to
not
give
giving
this
you this
person this
loan.
loan.
Yeah. But it's really scary.
Oh my, that has something to do with it.
It's
So you
really.
teach a bunch of judges this, and they all get like embarrassed and stuff. And this one judge will say, you know what? I mean, that's great. That's great that science shows this. But personally, every time I make a decision, I go through this whole process of saying one last time, was this the correct decision? Let me go through the facts of the case one last time, where sometimes I will change my mind. Wow, if there's no free will, why does that happen? And I say it's absolutely simple, because you've been raised to understand that sometimes you could be wrong.
Mhm.
You've been raised to become the sort of person where you can look at facts that are conflicting with each other. And instead of saying, oh, this is too difficult, I'm just going to do what the normal thing is here and make this decision, to think through that there might be a more complicated explanation. You have enough security because of how you were raised, because you were good at sports, because of who knows what, to be able to go back to your colleagues and say, you know, I was totally wrong in this decision. I had to change my mind. Because you are capable of feeling somebody else's pain to more of an extent than that judge can feel. That's why you were capable of doing that. And that's why this other judge doesn't do that. That's why you are a more patient school teacher when a child is making a mistake. That's why you're this kind of parent instead of that kind of parent. It's not by chance that you became this sort of individual. That's why you're able to do that. or
Wow.
can't do that.
That's both comforting and scary at the same time, seeing how many factors can influence so many critical decisions that one can make or others can make that impact your life. It's a bit scary, but also comforting in the sense that, well, it's not my fault after all. Maybe I mean, it was all preconditioned for people or for this to happen eventually. Yeah. So,
But as soon as you understand that science,
mhm,
you now have a responsibility to think about that science when you make your decisions.
true.
Oh, I'm hungry. Am I being the most generous and kind and patient that I'm normally being? Okay, I've learned that. Don't make decisions like that when it's too cold in a room or when I feel uncomfortable or when I here's an amazing finding also. You
Yeah.
look at surgeons and you look at how often they make mistakes,
Mhm.
and it's how long has it been since they have slept, how long has it been since they've had a meal. But an additional finding, surgeons make more mistakes when it's their birthday because they're thinking about the dinner, the birthday party they're going to that night, and they make more mistakes. You do not want to be like operated on by somebody when it's their birthday because they're really thinking about the party they're having tonight.
Wow.
That has something to do with it. Find out if the surgeon's birthday is today.
Yeah. So that
Judges give one other one, judges give out shorter sentences if they know it's the person's birthday.
so
If it's a day,
when you educated the judges on the the influence or of how hungry they are on their decision making, you said people should take the responsibility once they're aware. Did they receive that in a way where they affirmed it, like they want to change it, or how did they take it?
I'm sure they all left those classes saying, well, that was interesting stuff. God, I hate biology. That's why I became a lawyer and a judge. That stuff is just too complicated. But you know, I'm not like most other judges. I'm a very clear thinker. I'm a very rational thinker. I'm sure each one of them, just like your average doctor believes that they are a better than average doctor, your average person thinks they are a better than average driver of a car. Um, it takes a long time for people to really like think through these things. So I'm sure most of those judges are saying, oh, that's really cool stuff. That's why that person makes the mistakes that they do. Thank God I am so rational and such a clear thinker.
Yeah,
I I think that's probably mostly the outcome of those
that
things.
that definitely makes sense. All right, so I was planning to ask you questions about why zebras don't get ulcers, but I actually want to ask you first about another book, since we're talking about something that's related to ego, the trouble with testosterone. Uh, can you give us some key insights about that book?
Well, that's a collection of essays, but it's named after one particular one,
Mhm.
focusing on what turns out to be a total myth:
Yeah,
testosterone. What's the biggest difference between males and females? Males have testes, they have testosterone. What is testosterone? Testosterone makes you aggressive. Testosterone does not make you aggressive.
does not.
Testosterone makes you more aggressive to individuals you are already aggressive to. It makes you more exaggerated in the patterns of social aggression that you have learned. Great example of this. You take 5 monkeys, classic study,
Hmm.
5 males, and they're together and they have formed a dominance hierarchy. And number one
Yeah.
dominates two, three, four, and five. Number two dominates three, four, and five, and so on. They've got this strict dominance hierarchy. Now take number three in the hierarchy and inject him with an enormous amount of testosterone, a huge, huge amount. And you say, okay, well, what does this do to aggression? Does he get into more fights now? Yes, he gets into more fights. Whoa, does that mean he now is challenging? Number three is now challenging number two and number one and taking them on and rising in the hierarchy? Absolutely not. He is still just as afraid of number two and number one as he was before. What becomes now is he is a total bastard to poor number 4 and number 5. All he does now is make them miserable all day long. It is not creating aggression. It is just increasing the volume, the magnitude of the patterns of aggression that are already there. This is a primate who has learned I can get away with anything with number 4 and number 5. Number 2 and 1, I better be careful around and pretend to be all respectful of them. Testosterone is not making the aggression there. It's
Yeah.
making individuals who are already aggressive even more so. And it is making people more aggressive in the ways that they have more already learned how to be.
Yeah.
So that's not causing aggression. Don't blame aggression on testosterone in that case. Blame it on whatever thing that caused you to learn that this is an enemy. This is someone who I think is morally wrong and disgusting. This is someone I can be aggressive to and get away with it. And when I'm in a bad mood, I can be horrible to them and make me feel better. But it sure does not make you invent new types of aggression. Testosterone just increases the volume of what is already there.
Amazing. Interesting. So, whether it's related to testosterone or other research, what was the research that really had an impact on you as a person? Like when you performed or finished the research, you just thought, "Wow, I can't believe this is true." Did that ever happen?
Um, Probably, well, I guess two findings showing the two very different ends of the world that I've lived in as a scientist. One is like coming to the slow realization that, wow, we shouldn't grow up to want to be high ranking baboons. We should want to grow up to be like good friends and good family members. And that's going to be much better for your health. Um, and you want social connectiveness and all of that, which was pretty ironic because I was spending 3-4 months a year living alone in a tent
Mm-hmm.
on the other side of the planet. So there was some irony in that. So it took me a while to learn how to be a more socially connected human, and I can thank my wife for that. So that was a shocking realization. The other realization at the other end of the work that I do was in the 1980s, early in my science, when I found the first evidence that with chronic stress and chronic exposure to this one class of stress hormones, there's a class of neurons in your brain that can be damaged by the stress, that can be killed by stress. Stress can kill some of your neurons. And much of my 40 years since then in the laboratory has been spent studying that. Oh my God, I'd rather have friends than be a high ranking baboon. And if you don't get the stress under control, not only can it do bad things to this part of your body and that part in this disease, it could make your brain get older faster and kill your neurons. I guess those are the two findings that I've thought about over the years that made me stop in my tracks and say, do I want to make some changes in my life here?
So when it comes to stress, instead of discussing how zebras don't get ulcers, I have a question. Maybe it's a bit personal on a personal level. How do you deal with stress on a personal level? Uh, how do you fight it? How do you prevent it? You mentioned that earlier in your younger years, you were more competitive, wanting to, even when you saw how the primates, the baboons, they were behaving, you thought that your perception was the high-ranking baboon is something that is what you would like to achieve as a person in the future, if I got that correct. So, uh, how, I mean,
Yes.
from that person until the person today, how did you manage to deal with stress? How did you fix it in your life?
Well, I would say I'm actually terrible at handling stress. I'm stressed. Why else would I spend 40 years studying the subject if it wasn't something I was dealing with? And I've been amazingly good at being able to demonstrate to people, teach people, prove this type of social connectiveness is good for your health, and this type of stress is bad for you. I've been amazing at being able to give all that advice and pay absolutely no attention to what I'm saying at the same time, and to learn nothing about it for myself. Um, I'm incredibly stressed. I work. I'm beginning to change, but over much of my life, like, I lived in my laboratory. I worked very less. All that mattered was my, like, professional success and stuff. Fortunately, I married someone wonderful who said, "You're not sleeping at the lab anymore. You are going to," and kids, where I realized that that was kind of more important than how many papers I was publishing. Like, those have forced me to become a much, much saner primate. But without that, I was very much competitive and driven. And here's the here's the 14 different diseases, brain diseases I'm going to solve in my lab. And and you know,
Yeah.
realizing there's some things more important than ambition.
But your work, it has really inspired so many people, myself included. I mean, I was told about Robert Sapolsky, that someone called Robert Sapolsky existed by a friend, and he told me just check out his playlist on YouTube, the Stanford playlist, where you discuss the behavioral biology. And I was hooked. I was just going through the playlist, going from one video to another, and it just made sense. It helped me understand. So I really want to thank you for that. I'm sure what your work overall, the videos, your lectures, your book, your books, your research, it has helped so many people in so many different ways. So thank you for that. Although it's predetermined, but
Well,
thank you
thank you.
nevertheless.
Yes, I don't deserve any credit for that, but I
No,
cannot
you
tell you
deserve
how
all the credit.
pleasing it is to hear somebody 11 time zones away from me saying something like that. So that's really nice. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So I think our next segment for the show will be the Colin segment if we have the time for it. So I just want to thank you. And on a lighter note, if you have